The Grand Whitmore estate stood like a stone giant on the outskirts of Boston, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. For Elaine Johnson, the house had been both a blessing and a curse for nearly 3 years now. A blessing because the pay kept her small apartment warm and her evening music classes paid for. A curse because of the man who owned it. Elaine adjusted her simple black uniform as she climbed the servants' stairs at the back of the house. She was running 5 minutes early, as always. Being late to work at the Whitmore home wasn't an option if you wanted to keep your job. And jobs like this, ones that paid enough to support a dream, were hard to come by. "Morning, Rose," Elaine said softly to the older cook who was already kneading dough in the massive kitchen. Rose looked up with tired eyes and a warm smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Coffee's fresh if you need it. Mr. Whitmore's in one of his moods today. Had a phone call that didn't go his way before breakfast." Elaine nodded, pouring herself a cup of the strong black coffee. Bad moods from Mr. Richard Whitmore were as common as rain in April. The banking executive came from old money, the kind of wealth that had been in families so long they believed it was their birthright to have people scurrying around them. "Thanks for the warning," Elaine said, taking a quick sip before setting her cup down and reaching for her cleaning cart. "I'll start upstairs today, keep out of his way until he leaves for the office." Rose nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. Oh, and don't forget he's having some fancy dinner tonight. 12 people. Big shots from New York," he said. "Everything has to be perfect or there'll be hell to pay. Another party. Another night of watching wealthy people enjoy the kind of life Elaine had once thought might be hers. Before her father got sick, before the medical bills, before she had to put her own dreams on a shelf so high she sometimes wondered if she'd ever reach them again. Upstairs, Elaine moved quietly through the master bedroom, dusting surfaces and straightening items with practiced efficiency. 3 years had taught her exactly how Mr. Whitmore liked his things arranged. The heavy curtains pulled back just so. The pillows on his bed at precisely the right angle. The sterling silver brushes on his dresser lined up in perfect order. Her hands worked automatically while her mind wandered to the night ahead. Another long shift, another dinner party where she'd be invisible except when needed. She'd wear the same black dress all the household staff were required to wear for events, serve food she couldn't afford to eat, and pour wine that cost more than her weekly salary. Elaine moved to the next room, a sitting room with tall windows overlooking the garden. In the corner sat Mr. Whitmore's pride and joy, a gleaming black Steinway grand piano. Her hand slowed as she approached it, dust cloth hanging forgotten from her fingers. It was beautiful. Perfect. The kind of instrument musicians dreamed about. Elaine glanced over her shoulder at the empty doorway, then back at the piano. Mr. Whitmore was downstairs. The other staff were busy with their own tasks. For just a moment, she allowed herself to indulge in the fantasy of sitting down on that polished bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys without touching them. She could almost hear the notes in her head. The Chopin piece she'd been practicing in her tiny apartment on an old upright piano with 3 broken keys. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The cold voice from the doorway made Elaine jump back as if burned. Mr. Whitmore stood watching her, his tall frame filling the doorway, his face a mask of controlled irritation. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just dusting." Elaine lowered her eyes, clutching the cloth tightly. Richard Whitmore stepped into the room, his expensive shoes silent on the thick carpet. He was in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. His suits were always perfectly tailored, his manner always perfectly controlled, except when he was angry. "Were you? Because it looked to me like you were about to touch my piano, a piano worth more than you'd make in 10 years. His voice was soft, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "No, sir, I wouldn't touch it. I know better." Elaine kept her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold. "See that you remember your place in this house, Johnson. You're here to clean, not to admire what you can't have." "Yes, sir. It won't happen again." He nodded once, satisfied with her submission, then glanced at his watch. "The dining room needs extra attention today. I have important guests coming. People who matter." The implication hung in the air between them. "Unlike you." "I'll take care of it right away, Mr. Whitmore." He turned to leave, then paused. "Do you play?" The question was casual, almost friendly, which made Elaine instantly wary. She hesitated, unsure of the right answer. "A little, sir. Nothing worth mentioning." A small, unpleasant smile touched his lips. How quaint. "Well, stick to your dusting, Johnson. That's what you're good at." After he left, Elaine released the breath she'd been holding. She finished dusting the room quickly, avoiding looking at the piano again. As she pushed her cart to the next room, she reminded herself why she was here. Every dollar she earned brought her one step closer to finishing her music studies. One step closer to never having to clean another rich man's house again. The day passed in a blur of polishing silver, arranging flowers, and preparing the dining room for the evening's event. By 6 o'clock, the house was transformed. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light. Fresh flowers filled the air with their sweet scent. The long mahogany table gleamed like a mirror. Elaine slipped into the small staff bathroom to change into her serving uniform. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror. At 26, she still had the same determination in her eyes that had gotten her into the prestigious arts high school on scholarship years ago. The same hands that had once been destined for concert halls now smelled of furniture polish and silver cleaner. "You're almost there," she whispered to herself. "Just a little longer." Rose knocked softly on the door. "They're arriving, honey. Better hurry." The night unfolded like dozens before it. Wealthy guests arrived in expensive cars, air-kissing each other and laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Elaine moved among them silently, refilling glasses and removing empty plates. She had perfected the art of being invisible. Eyes down, movements efficient, expression blank. Mr. Whitmore held court at the head of the table, talking about the stock market and his recent trip to Monaco. The guests, mostly men in suits with a few elegantly dressed women, hung on his every word. Power recognized power, and in this room Richard Whitmore had it all. "Johnson," he called out as she passed with a tray of empty glasses. "More wine for Mr. Harrington here. He's telling me about the most fascinating concert he attended in Vienna." Elaine nodded and moved to the sideboard where the wine was kept. As she poured the deep red liquid into a fresh glass, she could hear the conversation continue. "Magnificent performance," said an older man with white hair and kind eyes, presumably Mr. Harrington. The pianist was just a young woman, couldn't have been more than 25, but she played Rachmaninoff like she'd written it herself. Such passion, such technique. "I've always appreciated fine music," Mr. Whitmore replied, though Elaine had never once seen him play the piano that dominated his sitting room. "Speaking of which, did I mention I just acquired a first-edition manuscript of a Bach cantata for my collection?" The conversation drifted to rare musical artifacts that these men collected but didn't play, purchased but didn't truly appreciate. Elaine served the wine and retreated to her position against the wall, watching the night unfold, feeling the weight of dreams deferred pressing down on her shoulders. Little did she know that in less than an hour, everything would change. The beautiful Steinway upstairs would be waiting. Mr. Whitmore would have a cruel idea for entertaining his guests, and Elaine Johnson would finally show the world what she could do. The dinner party at the Whitmore estate was in full swing. The main course had been served and cleared, and now the guests sipped expensive brandy and nibbled on tiny desserts that Rose had spent hours preparing. The conversation flowed as freely as the alcohol, growing louder with each passing minute. Elaine moved quietly along the edge of the room, collecting empty glasses and keeping an eye out for anything that needed attention. Years of practice had taught her how to be part of the background, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken. It was a skill that kept her employed but sometimes made her feel less than human. "You know, Richard," said the white-haired man named Lawrence Harmon, setting down his brandy glass, "I was just thinking about that piano I glimpsed upstairs. Steinway, isn't it? Concert grand?" Mr. Whitmore nodded, clearly pleased by the question. "Good eye, Lawrence. Yes, it's a Steinway Model D. Costs more than some people's homes." He laughed, and his guests joined in politely. "Do you play?" asked a woman in a red dress, her diamonds catching the light as she turned toward their host. Something flickered across Mr. Whitmore's face, a moment of discomfort quickly masked. "Not as much as I should, I'm afraid. Business keeps me too busy for proper practice." Elaine kept her expression neutral as she collected an empty plate. She had never once heard music coming from that room in 3 years. The piano was for show, another expensive thing to own but not appreciate. "That's a shame," said Lawrence, who Elaine had gathered was some sort of music professor or director. A fine instrument like that should be played regularly. Keeps the soul in it. Perhaps we could have some music, suggested another guest, a thin man with glasses who had barely spoken all evening. A little culture to end the night? Mr. Whitmore swirled his drink, his eyes suddenly landing on Elaine as she tried to slip unobtrusively toward the kitchen. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes and made Elaine's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Johnson," he called out, stopping her in her tracks. "Come here a moment." Elaine turned, her face carefully blank. "Yes, sir? I recall you mentioning earlier that you play the piano." His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it that made several guests look up with interest. Elaine's heart began to race. She had told him she played a little, and only because he had caught her looking at the piano. She hadn't volunteered the information, and certainly hadn't mentioned her years of training or the scholarship she'd once been awarded. "I wouldn't say that, sir. I know a few simple tunes, that's all." Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself now. "Don't be modest, Johnson. My guests would appreciate some entertainment." The room had gone quiet. All eyes were on Elaine now, and she could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, a few openly amused at the idea of the housekeeper performing for them. "I really don't think," she began, but Mr. Whitmore cut her off. "I insist." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request, unless, of course, you'd prefer to look for another position. The threat hung in the air between them. Elaine thought of her small apartment, her evening classes, the little money she had saved. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not yet. Not when she was so close to finishing her degree. "Of course, sir," she said quietly. "If that's what you'd like." Mr. Whitmore smiled triumphantly and stood up. "Excellent. Let's all move to the sitting room, shall we? Johnson will provide us with a little entertainment." The guests rose, some exchanging glances that Elaine pretended not to see. As they filed out, Rose appeared from the kitchen, her face creased with concern. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Mr. Whitmore wants me to play the piano for them," Elaine replied, her voice low. Rose's eyes widened. "That man, he's just looking to embarrass you, honey. You know that, right?" Elaine nodded. "I know exactly what he's doing. Can you play at all?" A small, sad smile touched Elaine's lips. "Yes, I can play." Rose squeezed her arm. "Then show them who you are, girl. Not who they think you are." With those words echoing in her mind, Elaine followed the group upstairs to the sitting room. The space looked different in the evening, with soft lamps casting a golden glow over the expensive furniture. The black Steinway waited in the corner, lid raised, gleaming like a predator in the shadows. Mr. Whitmore directed his guests to the comfortable seating arranged around the room, then turned to Elaine with a mocking gesture toward the piano. "Please, Johnson, whenever you're ready." Elaine stood frozen for a moment, aware of every eye on her. She was still wearing her serving uniform, the simple black dress with the white collar that marked her as staff, not guest. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her only jewelry a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She moved slowly toward the piano, feeling strangely calm now that the moment had arrived. This wasn't how she had imagined performing for an audience again, but perhaps it was better than not performing at all. The bench was cool beneath her as she sat down, adjusting her position with the automatic movements ingrained by years of practice. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she considered what to play. "Something simple, I imagine," said Mr. Whitmore with a chuckle. "Perhaps chopsticks?" A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked embarrassed. Elaine took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began to play. Not chopsticks. Not a simple tune or basic exercise. Her fingers struck the opening chords of Chopin's Ballade, numbered 1 in G minor, one of the most technically challenging and emotionally complex pieces in the piano repertoire. The powerful notes filled the room immediately, silencing every whisper, every clink of glass, every breath. The piece began with a gentle introduction that quickly gave way to cascading notes that Elaine's fingers navigated with practiced precision. The melody soared and dipped, telling a story of longing and triumph that matched the emotions swirling inside her. She forgot about Mr. Whitmore and his guests. Forgot about the uniform she wore and the duties she performed. For the first time in years, she was just Elaine Johnson, pianist, the girl who had once played in competition halls. the young woman who had made her piano teacher cry with the depth of her interpretation. The Steinway responded to her touch like a living thing, its voice rich and resonant in a way her tired old upright at home could never manage. Her body swayed slightly as she leaned into the music, letting it carry her through the difficult passages, the dramatic shifts in tempo and mood. When she reached the thunderous climax of the piece, her hands moved in a blur across the keyboard, unleashing a torrent of notes that seemed impossible for one person to produce. The room vibrated with the sound, the very air charged with the electricity of her performance, and then, just as suddenly, her touch became delicate again for the final, questioning notes that faded like a whispered secret. Silence fell. Elaine's hands rested on the keys as the last note hung in the air. For a moment she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't open her eyes. She wanted to hold on to this feeling for as long as possible, this sense of being whole again, of being herself. Then she heard it. A single person began to clap, then another and another until the room filled with applause. She opened her eyes to see Lawrence Harmon on his feet, his face alight with astonishment and something that looked like respect. The woman in the red dress was wiping tears from her eyes. Even the quiet man with glasses was nodding in appreciation. Only Mr. Whitmore remained seated, his face a mask of shock and displeasure. This was not the entertainment he had planned, not the humiliation he had orchestrated for his guests' amusement. That was extraordinary, Lawrence said, stepping forward. Absolutely extraordinary. Where did you study? Elaine stood up from the bench, smoothing down her uniform dress with hands that were surprisingly steady. I attended the Arts Academy on scholarship, sir. Before I had to leave. Had to leave? He repeated, looking genuinely puzzled. With that kind of talent? Elaine glanced at Mr. Whitmore, who was now staring into his glass as if he could find an explanation there. Life doesn't always go as planned, she said simply. Young lady, Lawrence continued, his voice serious now. I'm the Dean of Music at the New England Conservatory, and I would very much like to speak with you about your future. The room erupted in murmurs. Some guests were looking at Elaine with new eyes, seeing the woman behind the uniform for the first time. Others were watching Mr. Whitmore, waiting for his reaction to this unexpected turn of events. Elaine felt lightheaded, as if she might float away from the sheer impossibility of the moment. The Dean of Music at the conservatory wanted to talk about her future. After years of putting her dreams aside, of cleaning houses and serving drinks and pretending to be less than she was, someone had seen her. Really seen her, and it had happened in the last place she ever expected, in the home of a man who had never looked at her as anything but a servant. The night was far from over. Mr. Whitmore would not take this humiliation lightly. The guests would leave with a story they hadn't expected to tell. And Elaine Johnson's life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The sitting room of the Whitmore estate had transformed from a showcase of wealth into something entirely different. The air still hummed with the final notes of Chopin's Ballade, and Elaine stood beside the piano, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she faced the astonished guests. Mr. Whitmore finally broke the awkward silence that had followed Dean Harmon's offer to discuss Elaine's future. He stood up abruptly, glass still in hand, and forced a tight smile. Well, that was certainly unexpected, he said, his voice strained. Johnson, thank you for the entertainment. You may return to your duties now. Elaine hesitated, caught between years of obedience and the sudden opening of a door she had thought closed forever. Dean Harmon stepped forward, effectively placing himself between her and Mr. Whitmore. Actually, Richard, if you don't mind, I'd like a few more minutes of Ms. Johnson's time. The older man's voice was pleasant but firm. That was a world-class performance of one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. I have some questions for her. Mr. Whitmore's face flushed slightly. Several guests were watching him closely, perhaps wondering how he would handle this unexpected challenge to his authority in his own home. Of course. Lawrence, he said finally, the words clearly costing him, though I must say I had no idea my housekeeper was hiding such talents. He tried to make it sound like praise, but the bitter edge was unmistakable. Perhaps you never asked, said the woman in the red dress, raising an elegant eyebrow. The comment hung in the air, simple but damning. The room grew uncomfortably quiet again until a gentleman with a gray beard spoke up. I'd like to hear another piece if Ms. Johnson wouldn't mind. Something by Beethoven, perhaps? Other guests murmured in agreement. and Elaine found herself the center of attention in a way she had never expected when she'd put on her uniform that morning. She looked to Dean Harmon, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be happy to play something else," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As she turned back to the piano, she caught a glimpse of Rose peering in from the doorway, hands pressed to her mouth, eyes shining with tears and pride. Elaine smiled at her friend, then sat down at the bench again. This time she chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the full sonata, not just the famous first movement that everyone knew. The haunting, gentle opening flowed from her fingers, filling the room with its somber beauty. When she transitioned to the lighter second movement and then to the thunderous, passionate final movement, she put every ounce of her soul into the performance. By the time she finished, even Mr. Whitmore seemed affected, though he tried to hide it. The guests applauded even more enthusiastically than before, with several rising to their feet. "Remarkable," said Dean Harmon, shaking his head in wonder. "Absolutely remarkable. Miss Johnson, where have you been hiding?" "Here," she replied simply, gesturing to the room around them. "And in a small apartment across town where I've been taking night classes at the community college to finish my music education." "On a housekeeper's salary?" asked the woman in red, sounding genuinely surprised. Elaine nodded. "It's taken longer than I hoped, but I'm almost done. Not that it's any of our business," Mr. Whitmore cut in smoothly, "but Johnson has been compensated fairly for her work here." He was trying to regain control of the situation, to remind everyone of the natural order of things, him as the employer, her as the help. Dean Harmon ignored him. "Miss Johnson, I would very much like to hear about your background. Your training. What happened that led you here instead of to a concert stage?" Mr. Whitmore checked his watch with exaggerated concern. "It's getting quite late, Lawrence. Perhaps another time would be better for this career consultation." "I'm staying at the Parkview Hotel until Sunday," Dean Harmon said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card that he handed to Elaine. "Would you be able to meet me for coffee tomorrow? Say, 11 o'clock in the hotel restaurant?" Elaine took the card, its heavy cream paper feeling like a lifeline in her fingers. "Yes, sir. I could do that." She glanced at Mr. Whitmore, who was watching the exchange with thinly veiled anger. "If I could have the morning off, Mr. Whitmore." Put on the spot in front of his influential guests, Mr. Whitmore had no choice. "Of course," he said tightly. "Take the whole day if you need it." The thin man with glasses, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "I'm on the board of the Chamberlain Foundation for the Arts," he said. "We provide grants to exceptional musicians. I'd like to hear more about your story as well, Ms. Johnson." Another business card was pressed into her hand. Then another, from a woman who ran a small music venue in the city. And another from a music producer who had connections with a recording studio. Within minutes, Elaine had gone from invisible servant to the center of a network forming right before her eyes. Opportunities that had seemed impossible that morning were now being handed to her one after another. She felt dizzy with the suddenness of it all. Mr. Whitmore watched, his expression growing darker by the second. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "I think that's enough excitement for one evening. Some of us have early meetings tomorrow." The hint was clear, and the guests began to make polite noises about leaving. As they gathered their things and moved toward the stairs, many of them paused to speak personally to Elaine, to shake her hand or offer a word of encouragement. Mr. Whitmore stood rigidly by the door, forcing a smile as he said goodnight to each guest. Dean Harmon was the last to leave. He lingered behind the others, speaking quietly to Elaine. "What happened? Why did you stop pursuing music professionally?" Elaine hesitated, aware of Mr. Whitmore hovering nearby, pretending not to listen. "My father got sick when I was 19, she explained softly. "Cancer. I had to leave school to help care for him and support the family. By the time he passed away, the scholarship was gone, and we had medical bills. It just became impossible." The older man nodded, understanding in his eyes. "But you kept playing." "I had to," she replied simply. "It's who I am." "Indeed it is." He smiled warmly. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ms. Johnson. We have much to discuss." After the last guest had gone, Mr. Whitmore closed the front door with deliberate care. The house felt eerily quiet after the bustle of the party. Elaine stood in the entryway, still holding the business cards she'd been given, waiting for whatever would come next. Rose appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll finish cleaning up," she said quickly. "You've had quite a night, honey. Mr. Whitmore turned to face Elaine, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her as if seeing her for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. 3 years, he said. 3 years you've worked in this house, and not once did you mention you could play like that. You never asked. Sir? Elaine replied, echoing the woman in red's earlier comment. His jaw tightened. You made me look like a fool tonight. That wasn't my intention, wasn't it? He took a step closer. I think you enjoyed it. Showing up the man who signs your paychecks. Elaine kept her voice steady. You asked me to play. I played. I asked you to provide a moment of light entertainment, not to turn my dinner party into your personal audition. Rose moved to stand beside Elaine, her presence a silent show of support. Mr. Whitmore glanced at her, then back at Elaine. I suppose you'll be leaving us now, he said, bitterness creeping into his tone. Off to bigger and better things thanks to my guests and my piano. Elaine looked down at the business cards in her hand, then back up at the man who had tried to humiliate her and instead had accidentally opened a door to her dreams. I don't know what will happen tomorrow, she said honestly. But yes, I think things might change. Something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or simply the recognition of a missed opportunity. For 3 years he had had a concert pianist cleaning his house and he had never bothered to see beyond the uniform. You should get some rest, he said finally, his tone dismissive. If you're meeting Lawrence Harmon tomorrow, you'll want to be at your best. The man doesn't suffer mediocrity gladly. Thank you, sir. Good night. As Elaine turned to go, Mr. Whitmore called after her. Johnson. She paused, looking back. How did you learn to play like that? Really? For the first time that evening, his question seemed genuine without mockery or agenda. The same way anyone learns anything worth knowing, she replied. Hard work, sacrifice, and believing I had something to say that was worth hearing. She left him standing in the entryway, still holding his empty glass, surrounded by all his expensive things that suddenly seemed less impressive than they had that morning. In her small room off the kitchen, Elaine sat on the edge of her bed and spread the business cards out in front of her. Each one represented a different possibility, a different future than the one she had resigned herself to. Tomorrow would bring coffee with Dean Harmon and conversations that could change everything. But tonight, she simply savored the feeling of being truly seen, truly heard for the first time in years. She had played from her heart, and the world had finally listened. Elaine woke before her alarm the next morning, her mind already racing with thoughts of the day ahead. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her bedroom at the back of the Whitmore house, casting a golden rectangle on the worn wooden floor. For a moment she wondered if she had dreamed the events of the previous night. The piano, the applause, the business cards that now sat on her nightstand. But it had been real. All of it. She dressed with care, choosing her best outfit, a simple navy blue dress she had bought for her cousin's wedding last year. It wasn't fancy by the standards of the people she would be meeting today, but it was clean, well-made, and made her feel confident. She pulled her hair back neatly and added her mother's pearl earrings and a touch of lipstick. When she emerged from her room, Rose was already in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. The older woman looked up and broke into a wide smile. Well, don't you look nice, she said, wiping flour from her hands. Ready for your big meeting? Elaine's stomach fluttered with nerves. I don't know what to expect, Rose. What if last night was just, I don't know, a moment of kindness that doesn't lead anywhere? Rose shook her head firmly. I've worked in houses like this for 40 years, child. I've seen a lot of rich folks being kind for show. That wasn't what happened last night. That man, the dean, he looked at you like he'd found buried treasure. And those others, they know talent when they hear it. I hope you're right. I know I'm right. Rose reached for a paper bag on the counter. Here, I made you something to eat later. Don't want your stomach growling while you're talking about your future. Elaine took the bag, touched by the gesture. Thank you. For everything. Just promise me one thing, Rose said, her expression growing serious. When you're playing in fancy concert halls, don't forget about old Rose who used to sneak you leftovers from the boss's dinner parties. Elaine laughed. As if I could ever forget you. They hugged briefly, then Elaine glanced at the clock. It was still early, but she wanted to arrive at the hotel with plenty of time to spare. Better to be waiting than to keep Dean Harmon waiting for her. As she headed for the back door, Mr. Whitmore appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was already dressed for work in an expensive suit, his face set in its usual cool expression. Elaine hadn't expected to see him before she left. "Johnson," he said, nodding slightly. "Off to your meeting?" "Yes, sir," she replied, suddenly conscious of how different she looked out of her uniform. "Thank you again for giving me the day off." He waved away her thanks. "It seems I've been employing a concert pianist as my housekeeper for 3 years. The least I can do is give you time to explore your options." There was still an edge to his voice, but something else too, a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. "I appreciate that." He studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "Consider it a bonus." Elaine hesitated, surprised by the gesture. "Sir, take it," he insisted. "You've been a good employee, Johnson. Reliable. Thorough. If things change for you after today, I want us to part on acceptable terms." She took the envelope, understanding what this was. Not generosity exactly, but a man like Richard Whitmore making sure no one could say he had been anything less than fair in the end. It was the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." He nodded stiffly. "Good luck today." He turned to go, then paused. "You really are quite extraordinary on that piano." Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Elaine looked at Rose, who raised her eyebrows. "Well, I never," the cook said quietly. "Might be the first genuine compliment I've heard from that man in years." Elaine slipped the envelope into her purse without opening it. Whatever amount was inside, it wasn't about the money anymore. Something had shifted in the balance between her and Richard Whitmore, and they both knew it. The Parkview Hotel was one of the nicest in Boston, all polished marble and gleaming brass in the lobby. Elaine arrived 30 minutes early, her nerves increasing with each step across the plush carpet. She gave her name to the maitre d' at the restaurant entrance. "Ah, yes, Ms. Johnson," he said, checking his list. "Dean Harmon mentioned you would be joining him. He hasn't arrived yet, but I can show you to the table." She was led to a quiet corner table with a view of the hotel's courtyard garden. A crisp white tablecloth, sparkling silverware, and fresh flowers created an atmosphere of understated elegance. Elaine sat down, smoothing her dress nervously. For the next 20 minutes, she sipped water and tried to look like she belonged in a place like this. She watched other diners, business people, tourists, wealthy couples, and wondered if someday she might move through the world with their easy confidence. At precisely 11 o'clock, Dean Harmon appeared at the restaurant entrance. He spotted her immediately and strode over, a warm smile on his face. He was dressed more casually than the night before, in a tweed jacket and open-collared shirt, but still carried himself with natural authority. "Ms. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," she replied, shaking his hand. "I was early." He sat down across from her. "Punctuality. A good trait in a musician. The conductor waits for no one, as they say." A waiter appeared to take their drink orders. Dean Harmon asked for coffee, and Elaine did the same, declining his suggestion of something stronger for her nerves. "I'm fine, really," she assured him, though her heart was racing. "Just a little overwhelmed by everything." He nodded understandingly. "I can imagine. One day you're working as a housekeeper. The next you're having coffee with the Dean of Music at the New England Conservatory. Life can change quickly sometimes." "It doesn't usually," she said honestly. "Not in my experience anyway." "No," he agreed. "For most people, change comes slowly, if at all. But occasionally, Ms. Johnson, talent like yours forces the world to sit up and take notice." Their coffee arrived, giving Elaine a moment to collect her thoughts. When the waiter had gone, Dean Harmon leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "I'd like to hear your story," he said. "The full version, if you don't mind. How someone with your extraordinary abilities ended up working as household staff instead of performing on stage." So Elaine told him about growing up in a household where music was valued but money was tight, about the piano teacher who had recognized her talent when she was just 8 years old and had arranged for her to audition for a special youth program, about the years of practice the competitions won, the scholarship to the prestigious Arts High School. She told him about her acceptance to the conservatory at 18, the very institution he now led, and the one blissful year she had spent there before her father's diagnosis had changed everything. "I had to choose," she explained. her coffee growing cold in front of her. My mother couldn't manage alone. Dad needed care, bills needed paying. My younger brother was still in high school. So I left, took the first job I could find that paid enough to help. As a housekeeper, Dean Harmon said softly. She nodded. It wasn't what I planned, but it worked. The hours were long but predictable. The pay was steady. After Dad passed, I started taking night classes at the community college, trying to finish my education bit by bit. And you kept playing, whenever I could. I have an old upright piano in my apartment. 3 keys don't work properly and it hasn't been tuned in years, but it's mine. Dean Harmon sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Ms. Johnson, how close are you to completing your degree? About a year of classes left at the pace I've been going. He set down his cup decisively. What would you say if I told you there might be a way for you to finish at the conservatory instead? Elaine's breath caught. I'd say that sounds impossible. Difficult perhaps, but not impossible. He smiled. We have a special scholarship fund for exceptional cases. Students who demonstrate extraordinary talent and dedication, despite challenging circumstances. It's limited and highly competitive, but after what I heard last night, he shook his head. Well, let's just say you would be a strong candidate. I don't know what to say, Elaine whispered, her hands trembling slightly. Don't say anything yet, he advised. There would be a formal audition process, paperwork, interviews, but I wanted to meet with you first to understand your situation and gauge your interest. My interest? She almost laughed. Dean Harmon, finishing my education at the conservatory has been my dream since I was 16 years old. Good. That's what I needed to hear. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Here's information about the scholarship program, the audition requirements, and the application process. The next review cycle begins in 2 weeks. Elaine took the folder with shaking hands. I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity. Thank me by being prepared, he said firmly. This isn't charity, Ms. Johnson. This is recognition of exceptional talent that deserves to be developed. If you're selected, you'll be expected to work harder than you ever have in your life. I understand. There's more, he continued. Thomas Wellington, the gentleman with glasses last night, was quite serious about the Chamberlain Foundation grant. And Patricia Lowell, the woman in red, runs a small but respected chamber music series. She's interested in featuring you in an upcoming program. Elaine felt dizzy with the possibilities suddenly opening before her. After years of closed doors and deferred dreams, it was almost too much to take in at once. This is all happening so fast, she said. Dean Harmon's expression softened. Music careers often work this way. Long periods of struggle followed by sudden opportunities. The question is, are you ready to take the leap? Elaine thought about her little room at the Whitmore house. About the endless days of cleaning and serving and being invisible. About the envelope in her purse that represented the end of one chapter in her life. She thought about the Steinway piano and how it had felt beneath her fingers. About the music that had always lived inside her, waiting for its chance to be heard. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. I'm ready. Dean Harmon smiled. Then let's get to work. As they continued their conversation, making plans for her audition and discussing the pieces she might play, Elaine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the lightness of possibility, the certainty that her life was finally moving in the direction it was meant to go. Outside the hotel restaurant window, Boston continued its busy day, unaware that in this quiet corner, one woman's life was being transformed, all because a rich man had tried to mock her and had instead set her free. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of change for Elaine Johnson. Spring turned to summer, bringing warm breezes and new beginnings. The day after her meeting with Dean Harmon, she had given her notice at the Whitmore house. Mr. Whitmore had accepted it with a stiff nod and the comment that he had expected as much. Rose had cried and made Elaine promise to visit. The other staff had wished her well with varying degrees of surprise and sincerity. The envelope Mr. Whitmore had given her contained enough money to cover 3 months' rent. His way of acknowledging what had happened without having to say the words out loud. Elaine had used it to secure a small apartment closer to the conservatory. A practical place with good natural light and, most importantly, enough space for her old upright piano. Now, on a bright July afternoon, Elaine sat in the practice room at the New England Conservatory, her fingers moving over the keys of a Yamaha grand piano, as she worked through a difficult passage of Rachmaninoff. She had been awarded the special scholarship Dean Harmon had mentioned, after an audition that had left the committee members exchanging glances of amazement. She was officially a student again, finishing the education that had been interrupted years before. A knock at the door made her pause. Dean Harmon stood in the doorway, his expression pleased. "Sounding wonderful, Miss Johnson," he said. "How does it feel to be back?" Elaine smiled, flexing her fingers. "Like coming home after a very long journey." "Well, your journey is about to take another interesting turn." He handed her an envelope. "The Chamberlain Foundation approved your grant application. This is the formal notification." Elaine opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out the letter. The amount listed made her eyes widen. This is very generous," she said, struggling to find the right words. "It's what they do," Dean Harmon replied simply. "They find exceptional talent and make sure it has the resources to flourish. In your case, they were particularly moved by your perseverance through difficult circumstances." Elaine carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The grant would cover her living expenses while she studied, allowing her to focus completely on her music for the first time in her adult life. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," she said. Dean Harmon shook his head. "I merely opened a door, Miss Johnson. You're the one who walked through it with such grace. And speaking of walking through doors," he checked his watch, "we should be going. Patricia Lowell will be expecting us at the hall for your sound check." Elaine took a deep breath, butterflies stirring in her stomach. Tonight was her first public performance since her dramatic reveal at the Whitmore House, a short solo piece as part of Patricia Lowell's summer chamber music series. It was a small venue but a respected one, with a discerning audience of music lovers and critics. "I think I need a few more minutes with this passage," she said. Gesturing to the sheet music, Dean Harmon smiled knowingly. "Pre-performance jitters are normal even for seasoned musicians. But trust me, you're more than ready. Besides, we don't want to keep Patricia waiting. She can be rather formidable when displeased." Elaine gathered her music and followed him out of the practice room, through the hallways of the conservatory, where she was now a full-time student again at the age of 26. Other students nodded to her as she passed, some with curiosity, others with respect. Word had spread about her unusual path to the school, and while a few raised eyebrows at her age, most were simply in awe of her playing. The concert hall was a 20-minute walk from the conservatory, a beautiful old building with excellent acoustics and a rich history. Patricia Lowell met them at the stage door, elegant as always in a tailored suit, her silver hair swept back in a sleek style. "There you are," she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "We're running the sound check now. The Steinway arrived this morning. Wait until you try it. Magnificent action." Elaine followed her into the hall where technicians were adjusting lights and a man was making final adjustments to a gleaming black grand piano center stage. The hall was empty of audience members, but in a few hours every seat would be filled. "Go ahead," Patricia encouraged. "Get a feel for it. This is your time." Elaine approached the piano reverently, running her hand along its smooth surface before sitting down on the bench. She adjusted her position, then placed her hands on the keys. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the space, floating up to the high ceiling and wrapping around the empty seats like a gentle embrace. Patricia and Dean Harmon exchanged approving glances as they listened. When Elaine finished, Patricia nodded decisively. "Perfect. That's exactly what I want for tonight. Something beautiful but accessible to begin with, before you challenge them with the Rachmaninoff." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Elaine returned to her apartment to change into the new dress she had bought for the occasion, a simple but elegant black gown that made her feel like the professional musician she was becoming. As she pinned up her hair and added her mother's pearl earrings, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow. Still Elaine Johnson, but with a new confidence in her eyes, a certain knowledge of her own worth that hadn't been there before. 3 months ago, she had been wearing a uniform, serving drinks to wealthy people who looked through her as if she were invisible. Tonight, those same people would be watching her on stage, seeing her for who she truly was. The thought made her smile. When she arrived back at the concert hall, the lobby was already filling with well-dressed patrons. Elaine slipped in through the stage door where Patricia was waiting to show her to the small green room. 15 minutes, Patricia told her. The hall is nearly full. Word got around about you, it seems. Elaine tried to slow her racing heart. I didn't expect such a crowd for a chamber music series. People love a good story, Patricia said matter-of-factly. And yours is compelling. The housekeeper with the hidden talent, discovered by chance and now making her debut. It's the kind of narrative that sells tickets. She must have seen something in Elaine's expression because her tone softened. But they'll stay for the music, my dear. Your playing would fill seats even without the story behind it. When Patricia left, Elaine sat alone in the green room, gathering her thoughts and focusing her mind on the music ahead. A knock at the door startled her. 5 minutes, Miss Johnson, called a stagehand. Thank you, she replied, standing and smoothing down her dress one last time. Another knock came, softer this time. Elaine opened the door, expecting Patricia or Dean Harmon. Instead, Rose stood there, dressed in her Sunday best, a small bouquet of flowers in her hands. Rose, Elaine exclaimed, pulling the older woman into a tight hug. You came. Did you think I'd miss your big night? Rose asked, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Not for anything in the world. She pressed the flowers into Elaine's hands. From all of us at the house. Even Mr. Whitmore contributed, believe it or not. Elaine's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mr. Whitmore? Rose nodded. He's here too. Sitting in the back row, looking uncomfortable as can be, but he's here. I think he wanted to see for himself what became of his housekeeper. Before Elaine could process this information, Patricia appeared. It's time, she said simply. Rose squeezed Elaine's hand. You show them who you are, honey. Just like you did that night. With those words echoing in her mind, Elaine followed Patricia to the wings of the stage. She could hear the murmur of the audience, the rustle of programs, the subtle shifting of anticipation. Patricia stepped out first, welcoming the audience and giving a brief introduction. Elaine caught phrases like extraordinary talent and remarkable journey before her name was announced. Then it was time. Elaine walked onto the stage, the spotlight warm on her skin, the applause washing over her like a wave. She bowed gracefully, then took her seat at the piano, adjusting the bench and taking a moment to center herself. In the seconds before she began to play, she let her eyes sweep across the darkened audience. She couldn't see individual faces clearly, but she knew they were out there. Rose in the middle, Dean Harmon near the front, and somewhere in the back, Richard Whitmore, the man who had unwittingly changed the course of her life with one cruel impulse. Elaine placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Debussy's Clair de Lune, the delicate notes rising like moonlight itself. As she played, she poured every emotion of the past 3 months into the music. The shock of discovery, the joy of recognition, the bittersweet farewell to one life and the embracing of another. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause began, tentative at first, then building to enthusiastic appreciation. Elaine stood and bowed, her heart full. As she moved into the more challenging Rachmaninoff piece, she felt herself letting go completely, surrendering to the music that had always lived inside her, waiting for its chance to be heard by the world. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and passion, telling her story more eloquently than words ever could. By the end of the performance, the audience was on its feet. Elaine bowed again and again, accepting the bouquets that were brought to the stage, smiling through tears of joy and relief. Later, at the reception in the lobby, she moved through a crowd of admirers and well-wishers, accepting congratulations and answering questions about her unusual journey. Critics praised her emotional depth and technical brilliance. A representative from a recording studio handed her his card. And then, at the edge of the crowd, she spotted Mr. Whitmore. He stood awkwardly, holding a glass of champagne and looking out of place despite his expensive suit. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Elaine excused herself from her conversation and made her way over to him. Mr. Whitmore, she said simply. Thank you for coming. He cleared his throat. Quite a performance, he said, his tone carefully neutral. You've done well for yourself. Yes, she agreed. I have. They looked at each other for a long moment, the past and present hanging between them, employer and employee, privileged and struggling, the man who had tried to mock her and the woman who had transcended his expectations. I suppose I should thank you, Elaine said finally. In a strange way, none of this would have happened without that night at your piano. A hint of a smile touched his lips. I think we both know your talent would have found its way out eventually, Johnson. But I'm not sorry to have played a small part. It was as close to an apology as a man like Richard Whitmore could manage. Elaine accepted it with a gracious nod. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Whitmore. As she turned to rejoin the celebration, Rose appeared at her side, slipping an arm through hers. Look at you, the older woman said proudly. Just look at you now. Elaine smiled, squeezing Rose's arm as they walked together. Around them, people talked excitedly about the performance, about the promising career ahead, about future concerts and recordings. But in that moment, all Elaine could think about was the journey, from the little girl practicing scales for hours, to the housekeeper dusting a piano she wasn't allowed to touch, to the woman she was now, standing in her own light at last. She had played from her heart, and the world had finally listened.